relatively monthly basis, except for the summer months, although that I have to be careful about anything I say. It looks like we are going to have a July program, and that one's in development now. I'll make sure to get the full notifications out on it, and I think it'll be a very interesting one if it comes up the way we want. So anyhow, this is one in the continuing series of local history nights where we explore different topics that surround the history of Fresno and the surrounding areas. So tonight's program is I think a very interesting one, and one of the most interesting that I've ever done for this. Well, it is actually my first show I've done myself in the local history night series, but to my mind anyway, it starts it off with a bang because there's some interesting. It's an interesting story. There's some interesting facts in here. And I was absolutely captivated. What happened was I started out and I had discovered a bunch of aerial photos that had been taken in 1923 over Fresno and different county towns. We're going to explore that, and we're going to look more closely at those photos tonight. But what I discovered as I looked closer into this is that there was a whole backstory with the two men who had created this whole series, and they have been essentially forgotten by history, but we're going to go back and look at their record, and it is, and from end to end, it's an amazing story. One of the greatest stories I've ever found within Fresno area itself. So with that, I'll go ahead and here we go. Okay, just a few housekeeping things before we begin. Well, I think everybody has been muted, so the request to be quiet doesn't mean anything, but the one, but there are two other things nevertheless. And let's see. I just discovered the hide. Okay, here we go. So anyway, the second thing that we need to consider, if you can, your questions are more than welcome, but if you can do them through the chat box and just store them up until we're done with the program, they'll all get answered at the end, and we'll work it that way so that we don't lose any continuity. And for anybody who was wondering, yes, the program will be recorded and eventually uploaded probably in the next day or two to the library's YouTube channel. So there's our housekeeping, and now let me get on with the show. And don't ask me why, but my advanced, here we go. Okay, now we're in good shape. I didn't think my enter button was going to work for advancing the frames, but here we go. Okay, so tonight we're going to learn about Lloyd and Loxla, pioneer Fresno aviators, and they were, again, this is something that starts out something of a distance from Fresno, but then Fresno quickly comes into focus, and we'll find out about the players and what they did. As I was saying, it's a fascinating story, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Okay, so we start in the year 1917 when Europe was aflame, and the front was experiencing the first real air war that the world had ever seen. Well, you know, as much of a tragedy as World War I was, especially to Great Britain and less so to the U.S., but nevertheless, war is never a good thing. But the one thing that the war did do was open up the possibilities of aviation and all the other commercial aspects of it that no one had ever really thought of before. And in the wake of World War I, there were a lot of people who had noticed what was going on and was saying, well, there've got to be a lot of interesting peacetime uses for aviation. And these, of course, all kind of spun out after several years after the conflict had ended. Central to our story tonight are Lloyd Craig and Loxla Thornton, who you see there. Lloyd is on the left, Loxla is on the right. Lloyd was a reporter for the Fresno Morning Republican, and Loxla, as you can guess, was a commercial pilot who was based in Fresno. And the aviation world in this area, in the wake of World War I being rather small, the two of them got acquainted. I don't have a lot of details on how they got acquainted or what exactly went on, but nevertheless, they were a team, and they did a number of interesting things. I don't even have the time to get into all of them. Lloyd was a native of South Dakota, and Loxla was a native of Alabama. Not exactly sure what attracted Lloyd to California, but he came out here after serving in World War I. Loxla was later interviewed about how he got to California, and his answer was simply, "I came." He didn't really elaborate on it or anything, but needless to say, in the wake of World War I, California was seen as a great land of opportunity. There were a heck of a lot fewer people here at the time, and the price of housing, the price of land was less. So one of several rushes to get into California happened during that time, and Lloyd and Loxla were all caught up with that. Loxla was as you're going to see, Loxla was an extremely clever fellow. He, after he came to California, he did a few other things, and one thing that he was noted for around here, along with his aviation business, was he had the Thornton Machine Works, and he worked on motors and other mechanical things. This was something that he had started doing when he had lived in Alabama, and he was a born tinkerer, and he was always into these sort of things, and he made a very decent living at it. But and as I said, he was a businessman, he was a pilot, and interestingly, he hadn't been a pilot all that long when he came down to Fresno. He got his initial instruction in aviation in the Bay Area, apparently in San Mateo County, and he was trained by a pilot named Shirley Brush, who was said to be, I've gotten articles on this, they said that he was, Shirley Brush was a well-known pilot in the Bay Area, but history seemed to have forgotten him. Somebody who's more up on aviation history than I am may have something to say on the contrary to that. But anyway, he got his training, and the thing of it is, as accomplished as Loxla was, as illustrious of a career as he had as a young man, there's one other thing about him that you've got to know, and it's this. Okay, here's a larger version of the photo that you just saw, and notice that Loxla doesn't have a left hand. He's got a hook assembly, And it's true. Loxla was a pilot, and a very skilled one, who had no hands. It was said that there was nobody else in the world at this time who was a airplane pilot who had no hands, but Loxla did it, and amazingly, he learned how to fly the year he was working as a conductor for the Southern Pacific Railroad. He got into a freak accident when they were switching cars in Calexico, and lost both. He lost one hand, and then he lost the other hand and part of the forearm. So he was just stuck, but he had a burning desire to fly. He went up and got instructed by Shirley Brush, and that was it. It's amazing. Again, as with a number of details in this story, I don't know exactly if he was the only pilot with no hands who was flying at this time, but if not, he was one of a very small select group. But considering the fact that he lost both hands and turned right around and learned how to fly, he had hooks, he had special levers, he had special other devices that allowed him to do it. And so far as is known, the way he put it when asked, he said, "No, I've never rolled a tire," and that was slang for never had an accident. And apparently, throughout his entire career as a pilot, he had a spotless record. It's amazing. So as I got into this story, the one thing that I wondered about was, well, what was I've got photos and other things that you'll see in a few minutes. But the one thing I wondered about was, well, what plane was Loxla using for his flights? And the answer, and I developed this just by going by, looking at the different suspects for planes that would be obvious for commercial use at this time. But you can see in some of the photos we'll look at that at first, Loxla was using Curtiss JN-4 Jenny. This was the great workhorse for the U.S. military during World War I. They needed to train many pilots, and this was the training plane of choice. So after the war, when interest in different types of aviation applications was running high, manufacturing hadn't caught up with supplying planes for commercial use, and the Jenny was the ever popular choice for anybody who wanted to go into civilian aviation. You could buy those planes for about $300. The motors cost about $75, and they were widely available. I mean, even after factoring in inflation, these planes were very, very inexpensive compared to what a typical, civilian prop plane will cost you these days. But anyway, this is definitely what Loxla was using during the earlier part of his Fresno career. Now, the one way you can identify these and easily, you'll notice that radiator grill in front has this arch on it, and then the fuselage has that diagonal cut to it. That's the way, whenever you look, you can always figure that that's how you can recognize the Jenny. So that's, and fortunately, I figured all this out because I figured, well, somebody's going to wonder exactly what plane Loxla was using, and the Jenny was certainly it. Then he switched over and to something else, and I'll explain that a little bit later. Okay, so how does all this begin? Well, Lloyd Craig starts to work for the Fresno Morning Republican in 1922, and he soon partners with Loxla on a number of different projects. The first one of note was the big game between UC Berkeley and Stanford in the fall of 1922. Of course, we're used to seeing this type of shot over and over again, made by the Goodyear blimp and other aircraft. And thrown into TV programs. So this means nothing to us. It meant everything to people who were alive in 1922, because up until relatively recently, no one had thought to fly a plane over a well-attended football game and take pictures. So that's what Lloyd and Loxla did for the 1922 big game, and you could see the results. I apologize that our quality isn't so great with some of these images, but it's hard to work it otherwise. There's just there's so little that has survived in the way of continuous tone photography from the Republican archives, and most of what they had was dispersed long ago. Interesting story that follows all this. Normally, when ground level photography had been done for football games and other athletic events, and the Republican wanted to run them, they would have to, during this era, they normally someone would go up there with a camera, and that's what Lloyd Craig did. And then they would bring the photos back to Fresno by whatever ground conveyances were available. And then it would maybe be several days before you would see the pictures of the game. Well, in this case, they worked out an elaborate relay where they were able to get the film that Craig had shot of the game down to Fresno in 4 hours. They had a ground relay ready in case there was any failure on the aircraft's part, but the aircraft did just fine. Lloyd and Loxla got back on the ground in Fresno within about 4 hours after exiting the Bay Area, and then the photos ended up in the next morning's paper. It was an absolute miracle, considering how late these things normally ran at the time. So that was this is another small way that aviation was proving itself as a highly valuable conveyance for all types of things, including news photography. Now, not long after that, Lloyd and Loxla teamed up for something else that was rather interesting. As you'll see by the headline, they say grain planted by airplane for first time in history. Loxla wasn't the pilot. It was another guy who you'll see in a moment named Harrell, but Loxla owned the plane. And there was a farmer in the Tulare Lake Basin named Jensen, who wanted to explore the possibilities of planting grain on his property. And so the pilot and rented Loxla's plane, and they did a distribution of grain on the Larson property. Now, the one question you might be asking yourself is, well, is this a particularly accurate type of means to do planning? And I think history has proven the answer is no. They still do this. They will do it for cover crops and grasses and things like that, where you don't have to be particularly precise where you put the seeds. But for regular things like grain planting, I think that this was something that they played around with for a while, but eventually it ended. And then, kind of hazy, but you can see there's Ben Harrell, the pilot. There's Mr. Larson, who, pardon me, I think I said Jensen, but it's Larson, who was the owner of the property. And then you'll see Loxla in the center. And once again, you see that arched radiator and you see the fuselage. And now we can be certain that it was, and this is the first photograph that proves that it was a Jenny Loxla was using. Not to be deterred, Lloyd and Loxla went on to another project, and this, which ran in the spring issue of the Republican in 1923. This was touted as the first aerial photo ever taken of then Fresno State Teachers College. now, which now, of course, is morphed into California State University, Fresno, or Fresno State. And this was the old campus, which and now, of course, City College occupies it. And yeah, as far as if the Republican was accurate, and I think there's a high probability they were, this was the first aerial shot ever taken of the campus. So what does it look like today? Well, not too terribly changed. That building that was in the back of what's now called the administration building in the center was, as I recall, a power or steam plant. And they eventually raised it to make way for additional parking, which is still inadequate on the City College campus. But not too much for the main structure and everything else, not too much of a change. And it's pretty much the same thing that Lloyd and Loxla saw when they flew over it. And then there was another something else. They here we have what they don't bill it as the first aerial photo of the racetrack at the Fresno Fairgrounds, but if not the first photo taken from the air of that track, this is definitely one of the earlier ones. And this was another Lloyd and Lux team effort. It's amazing they got, while these aren't razor sharp, utterly perfect examples of photography, considering the shutter speeds of the film and how much vibration there must have been. It's really halfway a miracle that anything they got turned out this good. But again, a very early shot of that racetrack, if not the earliest. And then the accompanying story shows some of the racers who were participating in this 1923 event. Okay, and now here we get into the interesting part. And what started in the summer of 1923 was maybe the most historically important of all the collaborations that Lloyd and Loxla did. They started out and there's a whole series, and it's fascinating to look at it end to end, and we could only look at a piece of it tonight. But they went throughout the entire San Joaquin Valley and took these aerial shots of different cities and towns. And again, I can't vouch that these are the earliest aerials, but if not the earliest, they're very early in any instance. And we get the first snapshots of what these cities look like from the air, and it's fascinating. The one thing that I want to explain, and I'll show you everything that they did for Fresno County. One thing that's absolutely fascinating is that in many instances, the buildings that they have in their photos are still there. And there have been, needless to say, there have been a lot of changes. I mean, this is almost, at this point, this is almost 100 years ago. But nevertheless, there are survivals. And what I want to do is focus on the survivals, the buildings that you can still see that they photographed. And then there are several of them that are missing, but we'll get into, and I'll talk a little bit about those because sometimes there's an interesting story behind the missing ones. Okay, so you're looking at downtown Fresno here, and I'm sure some of you already notice certain of the landmarks. I mean, in many ways, there's still a lot of survivals of buildings in the central business district. But to parse this just a little bit, okay, there it is now. And again, you recognize a number of things that haven't changed. Of course, the main differences, I suppose, the county plaza is off in the corner. Chuck Chansey Park is off to the far left, and of course we've got a different courthouse, but and the railroad, which you can see in the upper left-hand corner, That whole area is considerably different than it was, but still a lot of survivals otherwise. What I'm going to do is break up this image in several parts so we can study it a little more closely. Okay, down on the bottom of that photo, you'll notice four structures. Tulare Street is running horizontally, and then on the far left, Hotel Californian, then the Kern K Hotel, then the Hotel Virginia, and then the Fresno Municipal Auditorium, not to be confused with the Fresno Memorial Auditorium, which is still with us. But again, there's the Californian, and there's the Kern K Hotel, which is now, I believe, all converted. It's hasn't been a hotel for years, but it is now office space. Then the Hotel Virginia, pretty, except for some of those ground level frontages, pretty much unchanged. And then we're missing the Municipal Auditorium, unfortunately, and that went down so that what's now the County Plaza could go in on that single block. But other than that, 3 out of 4 survivals along Tulare. You might have noticed these two buildings, which are just immediately south of Courthouse Park. One of them looks a little unfamiliar because of that sloping back, but if we flip them around and look at them from the Tulare and Van Ness corner, you'll recognize them as the Rowell building, and then next to it, the kind of humpback building, when you see it from the air, is the Liberty Theater or Hardee's to more recent audiences. Then above all that, there's the Courthouse Park with the old courthouse kind of more situated more toward the east than the current building is, and there it is not long before its demolition in the mid-60s. Then going back more toward the center of the picture, again, a number of things that are still there. To the left, that's the Bank of Italy building. On the bottom, not too familiar because we're seeing it from the back, that's the T.W. Patterson building. And then the Griffith Mackenzie or Helm building close to the upper right corner. And again, they're all part of Fresno's well-known downtown heritage and still there. And then as we explore the northern part of that image, again, quite a few survivals. Off to the left, there's the derelict but still standing Hotel Fresno. Then there's it's gone under several names, but it's what I think most people know as the Guarantee Savings Building. To its right, the Bricks Building, and then further right, the Corey Building, and then what's that building that appears to be under construction at the top? Well, again, here are more contemporary views of what we see in that part of the picture. There's the Hotel Fresno, Guarantee, Bricks still has a rather noble looking facade over the since all these years have passed. And then the Corey building, which underwent a remodeling some time ago, like some other buildings in downtown Fresno that probably would have been better off left untouched, but still there and still retaining something of its original appearance. And then that building at the top that was under construction is the San Joaquin Light and Power building, which is at the northern end of Fulton, and of course is one of Fresno's longtime landmarks. Okay, now we'll take a look at a few other places around the county. Here's Del Rey as it was in 1923, and at first pay special note to the kind of boxy looking rooftop in the lower right hand corner of the picture. And there it is. There's what Del Rey looks like today from roughly the same angle. That kind of, and Delray is still actually pretty active in agriculture, as it always has been. You'll notice that the railroad reservation is pretty much filled up, and it's devoted to different types of warehousing. But that kind of boxy looking building in the right corner, lower right corner, there's a better view of it from ground level. That is an old California Associated Raisin Company, now known as Sunmade Warehouse. They had a whole network of them throughout the county. Eventually, they were sold later on in the 20s, but a lot of those warehouses, the one they had in Fowler and the one that they have in Selma, are still standing, and they are very substantial brick buildings that were made to last. Going back to the mid-level of that Delray photo, what we've got running horizontally is what's now known as Morrow Street. You can see a business block with kind of a stately building at the corner end of it off to the right. And then there's another rather large building that's over on the far left. Well, they're both still in Delray. That's the old Delray Bank building. Has unfortunately seen better days, but the adjacent retail block next door to it is still there and functional. And as for the large building, it's still there too. It's the Swanson block, built in I believe that's 1915. But anyway, it was when Lloyd and Loxla went over and photographed Delray. It was a new part of the landscape, and now, as you can see, it's rather worn and weather beaten, but still there. Sadly, this is a kind of beaten up, blurry photo. I don't know, maybe Lloyd and Loxla got back to the ground and found out that they didn't have any good results. Again, with photo technology being what it was in these days, it's almost a miracle that they got anything in the first place. We are looking relative, that is a relative, what would it be, northeast view, kind of from over the railroad reservation in Fowler, which you can see in the lower left-hand corner. And that's what it looks like today. And over here, quite a few changes here. The only, and again, that photo is so terrible, it's hard to make out much of anything. But if we sight down Merced Street, which runs diagonally up and down from the, Merced is what starts in the lower left-hand corner and then runs up to kind of the center right. That of course is still the main street in Fowler. And that's what it looks like. Again, I apologize for the quality, but it's all we've got. So if you pay attention to the building in the left corner and then the building that's closer to the right upper corner, those two are still around. One of them is the Fowler Oddfellows building, now functioning, as you can see, as a CVS. And then the other one's the Fowler Presbyterian Church, one of the old time really beautiful churches that you see around the county. And that's about it for Fowler. Now here's Lloyd and Loxla's take on Kingsburg. The long horizontal street that you see is Draper, which remains the main drag of the town. And there you see it today. And in Kingsburg, there have been a lot of changes to the local architecture. If the buildings haven't been made over, they've been removed. And in that shot, the two main survivals, again, Draper is running at the top of this frame, and I'm pointing on the left to the water tower, and then on the right, you see the Evangelical Church. Water tower made over into the Swedish coffee pot. I think about, oh, now it's about 50 years ago, I think that happened. And then the Evangelical Church, another very beautiful earlier 20th century church, like many others scattered throughout the rural part of Fresno County. Now to Parlier, and this is where we see some really, really drastic changes. In 1923, the railroad, of course, was the mainstay, and you can see it running along the left-hand side of the picture. And those are packing houses that are right next to the railroad for obvious ease of shipping reasons. And then in the center right of the frame, you'll see J Street, which at that point was Parlier's main street. Now, since this time, Parlier has built out more west, and there's still kind of a commercial center there. And then here it is today. The railroad has been taken out completely, and the interesting thing is the eastern boundary of Parlier is still about what it was in 1923. That hasn't changed too much. And then, and this is a very, very big blow up from the J Street section that I mentioned. And as far as the buildings that are here, and it's one of the few Parlier's urban landscape has changed quite a bit. But those two buildings that you see there are still very much there. And once again, it's the Parlier Bank building and then adjacent commercial structures. But other than that, not a whole heck of a lot remains there. Now, we're shifting over to the Pinedale, the Sugar Pine Lumber Company in Pinedale, which, as the caption states, was one of the largest facilities of its kind and was the nucleus for today's Pinedale community. It's pretty easy to tell, even though this photo was taken pretty far up, that was a huge, huge, huge operation. And in the upper part of the frame, you're sighting to about Herndon Avenue, and this whole operation took up an enormous amount of space. This photo, of course, dates from 1923, like the others. But then in 1930, Loxla went back and they took another, and this was also a Lloyd Craig photo, but they went back and revisited the plant from a different perspective. And the long vertical street that you see is what's now known as Ingram. And to the right of it, you'll see the basic residential grid for Pinedale. What's left? Well, the Pinedale community is still left, but specifically what's left in the view of the lumber company that you saw earlier. The one survival we've got is the water tower, and that's it. Everything else has changed dramatically, and that particular, there's still a residential component to Pinedale, but then there's also this industrial park, and then there's also the retail that fronts Blackstone. But as for the plant itself, the water tower is now all we've got. Fairly recently, there were a couple of other large outbuildings, but those have now also been razed. Here's Reedley, and then is now the main business street is G Street, which you see running from the bottom of the frame to the top. And there are, and again, there's a fair number of survivals, considering that this was almost 100 years ago. That's what it looks like today. And as for the survivals, kind of focusing on the central part of the picture, At the very bottom, you see the old Reedley Hotel there, and off to the right, you can barely make out Winnie's rooms. That's another hotel, and then right above it is a bank building, and then in the upper part of the frame, the double water towers. Well, which have long been a landmark in Reedley. Well, all of it's still there. Now there's a back view of the hotel, and there's the street level intersection view of it. The hotel originally had 3 stories, and it was a very neat looking place when it did, but the third floor burned down at one point and they never replaced it. And the building has just been kind of a sorry hulk ever since then. On the left, you see the Winnie's rooms, the other hotel, and then the bank building is the one that has the curved corner, nice looking curved corner to it. And somehow my slide for the double water tower got lost, but it's again, it's still very much there and part of Reedley's landscape. And the caption is Sanger End of the Rainbow, and this is the last of the views. And again, we're sighting down what is still Sanger's main drag, and that's 7th Street. And there you see it the way it is today, and a decent number of survivals. This is, close to the central part of the image. Up at the top where it says you could barely make out Kuttner and Company, but that's the Masonic block. Then the Sanger Bank building is the one that is furthest to the left in the upper part of the frame. Then there's one commercial block and another commercial block, both of which are still there. There's the Masonic building with the emblem still intact. There's the Sanger Bank building, a very nice example of its kind. There's the commercial building. There's what I call commercial building number 1. Again, kind of weather beaten, but still there. And then across the street and somewhat catty corner, there's the other commercial building, and still part of Sanger's urban landscape. So that's what the 2 guys did, and that's a remarkable historical record for us. And like I said, if those aren't the very earliest photos of their kind, they're at least quite early. And Lloyd and Loxla didn't stop there. They were involved in a number of other interesting ventures. Here we see something, this was more Loxla's thing than Lloyd's. But once again, you can't miss the grill of the Jenny, and these women are standing next to it. This is an article that the photo ran in the September 28th, 1924 edition of the Republican. This was something that had gotten to be a hot deal in Fresno. Women would go out and have their tea and crumpets and have a social hour, and then when it was finished, they headed down to the airport, and they boarded a plane and took a spin around town to see everything from the air. And they called these things air parties. I don't know how long this was a fad in town, but it was definitely alive and kicking in this year. As for the women in the shot, I'm not exactly sure who Mrs. Mountford Crowell was, but Mrs. Twining, of course, was the wife of the man who ran Twining Labs, which is still alive and kicking over on Fresno Street in downtown. And Mrs. W.O. Blasingame, of course, the Blasingames have been into ranching in Fresno County ever since there's been a Fresno County, and they're still at it, of course. So that's kind of an interest, even though we only know about a couple of them, that's still an interesting group of people there. And then at some point, Loxla decided to improve on his plane. And, here's, you see at the top the special built monoplane. This was custom built for Loxla by a family that operated out of Clover Field in Santa Monica. Clover Field, of course, is still alive and going on, and there's the Monty family, and they're on the wing of a Jenny. These people were true aviation pioneers of Southern California. They operated out of Cloverfield, and as you see, they did aerial survey, oblique photography. They also did a charter air service, and at one point they were even associated with Donald Douglas, who went on to form McDonnell Douglas. And this all dates from an era when aviation was kind of a boutique thing, and the Monty family did a little bit of everything, and they also manufactured planes. Interestingly, they made their planes up from scrap, and they would use diverse parts from different planes to make these kind of Frankenstein deals. And that apparently is what Loxla bought, but it was probably all done to his specifications, and it wouldn't be far off the mark to suggest that maybe he needed certain modifications, and it was the Montes who were able to do that because they were custom plane builders. They didn't last too long at that. I read an article that said they only made about 12 planes total, and apparently Loxla owned one of them. So that's an interesting little fact. Now, in 1927, one of the big events in aviation history was Charles Lindbergh's flight, transatlantic flight to Paris. And that got wheels turning in Loxla's head. And in 1928, guess what? He made a trip to Southern California, and he began to see if, because these things were always major undertakings, but he thought he'd see if he could interest investors into financing him to do a transcontinental trip like Lindbergh did. Well, I don't know. Apparently, this didn't come to fruition. Maybe they were scared of insuring him. Maybe the investors were worried that since he had no hands, they were asking for tragedy. But for whatever reason, great idea, but it just never came off. And then in 1928, Loxla didn't participate in this, although there were other air meets in Fresno where he did. But this was the first air meet at the Fresno Fairgrounds, and these photos were taken by Lloyd Craig. 10,000 people were in attendance. It attracted a lot of attention. And interestingly, two of the pilots who were doing stunts at this show were Claire and Jimmy Angel. Jimmy Angel spent a lot of time around the Fresno area. And as some of you will know, he's the fellow who discovered Angel Falls in Venezuela, which last I checked was still the highest waterfall located anywhere in the world. And as I said, he spent some time around Fresno, and that story hasn't been put together yet by anybody. But of course, he was nationally, he was also a very well-known aviator. And here we hit the first really sad parts of the story. Turns out that the FAA ended up, they caught up with Loxla. And when they found out that he was flying around without any hands, they said, no, we can't allow you to do this anymore. There were several hearings. People, including Lloyd Craig, vouched for him and said that, look, he has a spotless record. He knows how to handle himself in spite of everything else. But the FAA grounded Loxla in 1930, and he never flew again. It had to have can you imagine? It had to have broken his heart. And so after that, he had to shift his attention to other things. And he never, but after 1930, he never flew again. And then some of you may recognize this. This is one of the more even to this day, this is one of the more noted aviation disasters. And if it isn't immediately recognizable, it probably will be to more of you when I shift to the next slide. It was the Wiley Post, Will Rogers fatal accident in Alaska on August 15th, 1935. And what is, I don't know if you'd call it ironic, it's definitely interesting. 3 days later, Lloyd Craig, who had earlier left the Fresno Morning Republican and was working for the Sacramento Union. But on August 18th, 1935, Lloyd Craig succumbed to asthma attack in Sacramento. And so he passed, and with him passed, as you can see, a very, very interesting chapter in Fresno's aviation history and photo history, for that matter. Loxla did continue for some time after that. Here's an article from the 1945 Fresno Bee, where they report that he had been developed because he ran a machine shop and he was a born tinker. He was forever inventing new devices that would help the mobility of people who had lost feet and hands and limbs. You can see right there, he's on a slate, he's writing his name, equipped with his hook contraption. And he's a mighty good penman on top of everything else. But they said, he could bait a hook and fish. He could shoot with a rifle. He could button and unbutton his shirt. He could eat with a knife and fork. There really wasn't anything that stopped him. And, in spite of having, several huge setbacks in his life, the man just kept on going. And when he wasn't able to fly anymore, he shifted more toward the prosthetic device industry and was selling some of his inventions to the military for the benefit of veterans who had come home and were missing limbs. And there you go. There's one, I'm not exactly sure how many patents he had, but there's the patent that he obtained in 1951 for a special leg brace. And there were more inventions than that. And so again, this is just another sidelight in a very, very remarkable career. And then a year after he succeeded in getting this particular patent, he passed away in Fresno. He lived over on Christmas Tree Lane in an old fig garden. And apparently between his different ventures, I suspect he did rather well for himself. And then this brings us to the final part of the program. And Loxla had a daughter named Madeline Thornton. And she was nearly a lifelong Fresno resident, went to Fresno High School and was a graduate of the 1948 class. And this is from the Fresno High School 1948 yearbook. She later on, she married an accountant, Jamie Davidson, and he was one of the principals in the Stoughton Davidson accounting firm, which was important around here for a number of years. If I'm not mistaken, he passed a while back. But anyway, Madeline went on to a career of her own. And for those of you who are reading the Bee in the 80s and 90s, maybe you'll remember Madeline Davidson's food column. Well, that's Loxla's daughter. And so that's where this story ends up. But the fact that of course, there was a time when he was pretty noted around town, but when he passed away, the Bee surprisingly, they didn't run a feature story or anything else. I think today they'd go huge on something like that, but there was really practically nothing. But in any event, his daughter certainly ascended to a career of local renown by herself, and that's just a fascinating thing. So that brings everything down to the present. So that is our story, and as I promised, I think that this is just a fascinating journey throughout local history and related things. And let me see. I'm checking the chat, but did anybody have any questions? Yeah, and thank you for saying that. Like I said, I think that this is one of the big stories to come out of Fresno that had just been kind of buried for years. And once I discovered those aerial town photos, I just kept going from there and got a hold of the rest of the parts. Okay, yeah. Sorry, no, it was just if there had been a Selma photo, I would have been happy to, and I certainly would have put it in. But they didn't, that wasn't on the Lloyd and Loxla list, so we don't have it, and I wish we did. And thank you, Janine, and thank you, Celeste. Yeah, I hope that, but anyway, I hope that was all pretty self-explanatory. I tried to cover the bases as much as I could. The problem of that plane at first really bugged me, but surprisingly, it didn't take me too long to figure out that Loxla's main vehicle was the Jenny. So that was good. But if anybody has any other questions, they're welcome to ask them now. And just to give you a preview, on June 10th, and the announcements will be coming out soon, we'll be doing another local history night. And this one will be helmed by Jim Spitz, who has just now completed the first history of the Highway 180 corridor. And it's surprising that nobody has ever tried to tackle that as kind of a regional history within Fresno County, but it's a fascinating story, and he'll show you exactly why it is. But we'll have as I was saying, that'll be June 10th, probably at 7, but the announcement will be coming out on that fairly soon. And we'll have that out, and I'll get the announcements out on it. And as I said, surprisingly, we'll probably do something else in July. And if it comes together the way I hope it will, that'll be a very exciting, interesting program to attend. So if I don't hear anything else from the audience, I'll go ahead and we'll depart for tonight. But thank you for being an involved and rapt audience for all this. I certainly do appreciate it, and I'm always gratified by the amount of interest that these programs generate. And something else too is that we'll also start this all up again in earnest in the fall, and we'll have the announcements going out on those programs as well. And I think everybody who's attending tonight will attend those once they happen. So I think that's about it for tonight. Again, thank you all for attending and being a great audience. Appreciate it very much, and hope to see you again in June when we explore the history of Highway 180. Thanks very much, everybody, and be back with you soon.